So, welcome everyone. My name is Amirthini Keefe. I am currently the executive director at the Domestic Abuse Project in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm excited to be here today to talk with you about racial bias and how we can use our power to facilitate change with folks that use violence. Just to share a little bit about myself, I am first generation born here in the US. My parents immigrated from Sri Lanka. I am a mother, a wife, a daughter, a sister. I'm a social worker and I'm a leader. My upbringing was really interesting in that my parents had to figure out how to maintain the culture that we were coming from while they were also trying to adopt the culture here. And that led to lots of different teachings about how to navigate the world. Our homeland was racked with decades of civil war. And because of that, there was also a lot of teachings around safety, around fear, around idealism, and around gratitude that really helped shape my life in the way that I started out as a social worker. And there was a lot of learning and unlearning that I had to do. So I'm a clinical social worker by trade. I have been working in the domestic violence field for about the last 7 years, almost 7 years. And the last two as the executive director, I was a program director prior to that. And that's where I started doing intervention and prevention groups. But I will say that my true beginning to doing some depthful racial bias and implicit bias work was in my first role as a social worker doing street outreach with homeless youth. And part of that was I had to walk towards people that I was really taught to avoid. And I had to do a lot of unlearning in order to be an effective practitioner. I thought I learned a ton. Then I became a leader and realized I knew nothing, or not nothing, but I had a lot further to go. So today, what I'm going to do is share different experiences that I've had, different experiences that my organization has had as we've done our own collective work to talk through what racial bias can look like and what some tactics are that you can use to address it either within yourself or within your organization. So should have read this first, but this project is supported by a grant that was awarded through the Office of Violence Against Women and the US Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, recommendations that I might make today are those of my own and other folks that maybe I'm borrowing their wisdom. And it does not reflect the views of the US Department of Justice. All right, so today we're going to talk about some guiding principles that the Center for Justice Innovation actually created to help folks that are working with folks that use violence really think through what's important. How do we want to center and root ourselves in our work? We're going to talk about what implicit bias is and what racial bias is. We're going to talk about the impact of racial bias in our work and engage in some skill development for how to address it. So, the Center for Justice Innovation. I think it's now been a couple of years. They gathered a group of folks that either were working with culturally specific communities that were engaging in innovative intervention work, or folks that have been doing this type of work for decades, and brought us together to have conversation around what is important to center when you're working with folks that use violence. And we came up with these 7 guiding principles. The first is that survivors' voices are centered. So something that I talk with my team about is even if you're sitting in a group full of folks that have used violence and we're talking to that individual, we're talking to the members that are in that group, we want to think about the victim as sitting right behind them and being in that same space so that everything that we're saying is something that we would be comfortable with the victim hearing and is really ultimately focusing on their safety. That accountability is personal, communal, and systemic. So we have the responsibility to do our own accountability work, to do it as an organization, and to look at the different ways that we can engage in that change in the systems that we're working in, but also the systems that our participants have to move through. That hope and dignity are restored. And I think a lot of times our participants might have a hard time hanging on to hope. And so it's our job to hold on to it until they can take it over and to really work to instill a sense of self, a sense of value within themselves, and look at them as more than just a person that's used violence, but who are they 3 dimensionally? What are other parts of themselves that they can leverage to help make that change? That culture and community are reflected and valued. So we're bringing in different aspects of people's identity and really thinking about how that has framed the way that they work or the way that they engage in violence and the way that we might engage in change work with them. That interventions respond to needs and strengths. So we're not focused on things that are negative, or I should say that help people or create a sense of shame or lack of capacity, but that we're really thinking about how we can empower folks and recognize their own expertise in making their own change. That racial justice is centered, and that we are thinking about different types of harm that we might engage in or systems of oppression that our participants are navigating. And that self-reflection is prioritized, which is one of my favorites, to the great chagrin of my team, but really thinking about how we do our own work in the same way that we're asking other people to do their work. So when you walk away today, I hope that you have an increased knowledge of what racial bias looks like and how it might show up within your own self and your own systems and organization, that you can identify at least 3 ways that racial socialization can impact your work with folks that use violence, and that you will have at least 3 tactics that you can use to address racial bias and socialization in your work. And we'll be actually walking through 7 different types. Okay, so we are going to actually start by doing something experiential. So I just wanted to say, I'm going to show some images and have us reflect on what we're seeing. They're not gruesome, but for folks of color, they might be somewhat triggering. So I just want to name that. Please take care of yourself. If you do get uncomfortable, I ask folks to try to sit with that discomfort. Unless it's overwhelming, then take the space that you need so that you can be present throughout the presentation. And I'm going to do something that people don't usually do, which is ask you to take your tech out. So I would love for you to grab your cell phone, or if you're on a laptop, open a new tab and go to the website menti.com and enter this code 56410433. And Brittany has put it in the chat. And we're going to use this platform to do some anonymous reflection. I'm going to ask that folks take the risk of being vulnerable, take the risk of being honest. And as you're reflecting on the images that I am about to show you, I want you to respond by focusing on what the initial response is to what you're seeing, and not think too deeply about it, but just notice what comes up right away and name that. So I'm going to show you this first set of images, and I want you to look at these photographs and note in the Menti website what some characteristics are, some beliefs, some assumptions that might come to mind. We'll take a minute to look at these. And then if folks could enter what characteristics, assumptions, beliefs come up when they're looking at that series of photos. We're going to go to the next one. So with this next set of photos, I want folks to, again, name what comes up for them initially and write down their observations. All right. What came up when you were looking at those images? All right. We have one more image. So when you're looking at this photo, what comes to mind? Okay. Thank you. And before we move away from this, I'd like for you to now do a little reflection around what you're noticing in your body when you were looking at these photos. So think about what you're physiologically feeling. I would do a scan from your head, your jaw, mouth, eyes, shoulders, neck, your chest, arms, your gut, your pelvic area, thighs, calves, and your feet. So heaviness, shortness of breath, rage, bad gut feeling, sadness in your chest. A lot of people feeling tightness in their chest, anxiety, tension. And then this last one. Where do you think your perspectives and assumptions come from? When you're thinking about race, where do you think your teachings came from? So experience, social media, parents, observation, society, environment, the church, culture. Not sure. Glad you're here. How you were raised. Mhm. Doing my own work. Awesome. Okay, you guys can keep filling that out. Would love that. I will say when I have done this in the past, and I feel hopeful actually looking at the images that you all shared today or the words that came up for folks today. When folks have seen, oh shoot, I said from the beginning, I'm sorry. When folks have seen this image or these images, what has typically come up, and I've done this with hundreds of folks that work with folks that use violence and with students that are learning to be practitioners. The words that have historically come up are dangerous, gangs, Black men, evil, troublemakers, scary, tough. And with these images, it has been friendly, happy, community member, educated, confident, accomplished. And with this picture, one of the predominant words were victim. Friendly, happy, hardworking, professional. So what I noticed when I first put this slide together is that when I was looking at photographs on social media, the pictures that are on slide A are the photos that were most often used, most represented online in the news when people were talking about these folks. The images on the right, on side B, were present, but much harder to find. And folks hopefully know who all these individuals are, but this is Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Philando Castile, all individuals that were killed either by police officers or by a community member that believed them to be aggressive and at risk for their own safety. And so what does this tell us about the ways that we take in information and what's actually provided to us around how we perceive people in general, men specifically, and different folks from different cultures? When I looked for a picture of Justine Diamond, who's also from Minnesota and was also killed by a police officer, this was the only photo that I was able to find at the time. So along with images, when we are navigating racial bias or thinking about the different ways that we're socialized or conditioned, one is the things that we see. Another is the words that are used. And so this is an example of a news headline around Philando Castile, who was from Minnesota, shot and killed by this police officer. And the headline is "Killer Cop Says Philando Castile's Audacity to Smoke Marijuana in Front of a Child Made Him Fear for His Life." Less than 2 months later, another article, "Marijuana Moms Say Smoking Pot Makes Them Better Parents." When we're looking at this, it's photographs that depict different ways of seeing a person. It's the perspectives that we have around them, and then it's how we interpret their behaviors, right? So if it is a person of color who's smoking pot, then they are dangerous, they are poor parents, bad decision makers, and your safety is at risk. If it is a white-bodied person, then maybe it's an innovative way to parent. Their parenting is being looked at as something that's evolving and developing and positive. And we see these in lots of different ways through lots of different avenues that we're taking in this kind of information that absolutely shapes the way that we see the world. And I think when we're thinking about what's happening in our bodies and what we're noticing when we're looking at these images, I think that we often will confuse discomfort and differences in values or personal behaviors with this lack of safety. The perception of the lack of safety is often determined by the person's racial identity and in association with whatever behavior that we are contemplating. And I think it becomes a structured thought, and these structured thoughts become systems that we use to discriminate, and that harm is really rooted in. And these are the things that we want to break down as we continue to engage in our own work and really pay attention to when we're working with folks that use violence. I know that those photos I showed happened a while ago, but to name that it's still happening, right? So we have Breonna Taylor, we have a gentleman that got into a car accident and went up to a neighbor's home or a community member's home to get help and was shot and killed by the police. Someone who was jogging and was shot and killed by folks in his community. George Floyd someone from Minnesota that I think the entire universe knows now, that really led to a lot of reflection and change in the community. But I wanted to add that not is it just the way that we think about how we see people, about how we think about their behaviors, but it's also what we then do to hold them accountable. And so another example is Brock Turner is an individual who went to a prominent school in California. He was convicted of rape, of sexual assaulting somebody who was unconscious, and he was given 6 months of time to serve, and he only served 3. And this image is actually one of the most predominant images that were online about him when the case first broke out. And then Corey Beatty is athlete, also went to a prominent school, also convicted of sexually assaulting someone who was unconscious. So really similar crimes. And he was given 15 years. There's a lot of similarities between these two men and their stories, between the crimes that they committed. And the difference is their race and the race of their victims. So Brock Turner's victim was a person of color. Corey Beatty's victim was a white woman. And all this to say, not that someone should be given less time for doing something that's horrific, but that there is absolutely a difference in the way that we dole out punishment and accountability. Okay, so what is racial bias and how is it connected to implicit bias? So when we think about who we are as humans, we're absolutely not neutral when it comes to our attitudes and our perceptions about people. Our unconscious and implicit bias refers to our thoughts, our feelings that we are unaware of. It's attitudes and associations that we have about people without our conscious knowledge. And these are often rooted in the core beliefs and the teachings that we have had throughout the course of our life. Racial or ethnic bias is defined as engaging in discriminatory behavior, holding negative attitudes towards or otherwise having less favorable reactions towards people based on their race or ethnicity. So implicit bias is the thinking behind it, and racial bias is the action that comes from that thinking. So what we're talking about today, I want to say, is also centered around race, but it absolutely is applicable to any other type of identity, whether we're talking about sexuality, gender, class, religion. All of these things are important for us to pay attention to within ourselves as a provider and when we're thinking about the people that we're working with. I think when folks think about core beliefs, we can get really embarrassed by what comes up for us because we know that's something that we shouldn't think, even though it is the way that we think. So to really normalize and give ourselves some grace in recognizing that this is something that we were taught and taught through teachings from our parents, like folks were talking about caregivers, through school, through healthcare institutions, through social media, through the news, through music. There's so many different avenues that we're constantly being bombarded with how to see people and how to see ourselves. What is interesting is when we're thinking about actually doing this work, reflecting on ourselves, there's some studies that looked at racial socialization practices among white-bodied folks, white parents. And what they found is that white parents are generally unlikely to discuss race with their children in a direct manner. Parents with less biased racial attitudes and communities of color are more likely to engage in conversations that will raise social and racial consciousness and promote equity and equality. And we see this, I'm sure you see this in your places of work where some folks are really comfortable talking about race and some folks really are not. But what this does tell us is that we are absolutely the best tool to navigating racial bias, right? If we take time to care for and better understand ourselves and pass those teachings on to the people around us, the people that we work with, the people that are part of our lives, it can increase awareness and equity in the communities that we're a part of. So this seems really simple. We all know it's really difficult. And I think often we try to do it by ourselves. But something I really want to hammer in is that when we are doing intervention prevention work, we really value doing it in a group setting because of all of the mutual aid and the benefits that our group members get from being able to hear other people's stories, practice accountability conversations, take in feedback, and support each other. And I think the same goes for having these types of conversations. We're still talking about a form of harm, and it's really hard to do in a vacuum when by definition, you might not always see what is implicit, and you might need somebody to call out your action that is discriminatory so that you can walk it backwards and really start to think about where it's coming from. And this is a concept that we talk about in intervention programming all the time. It's really looking at what our core beliefs are and really trying to unpack where does it come from? How has it impacted the way that I navigate through the world? What of that is valuable and can help me feel empowered to navigate the world differently in a healthy way in the way that I may want to? And what is it that I need to let go of? The same goes for conversations about race. And this is a favorite quote of mine. Daryl Wing Sue has written a gazillion books about race and microaggressions and how to navigate through these types of reflections and work. But I love this quote. While self-change requires becoming a non-racist person, societal change requires becoming an anti-racist one. And what this means is that we can have all of the insight in the world, but if we're not actually putting that insight into action, then we're not engaging in an anti-racist way, which is extremely important when we're working with folks that are part of systems and in life in general. Okay, so what are some of the tactics? The first tactic is recognizing your power as a facilitator or a person that works with folks that use violence. I think that there are tons of ways that we as facilitators, probation officers, police officers, folks that are part of the judicial system hold a ton of power. I'm going to talk specifically about learnings that my organization has experienced around working with folks in a mental health setting. So thinking about the impact, and I want you to think about in your setting what this might look like, but recognizing that as a facilitator, we hold a lot of power around whether or not somebody is able to complete programming, what it looks like when we're drafting policies, and how we're actually applying those policies and practices. What it can look like when we are engaging in racial bias is a lack of intervention. And what that can look like is we have a white-bodied group member who maybe is saying something that's really dismissive or victim blaming, and we don't intervene or call in that statement, but we do when it's a person of color. It might be that we have a policy around attendance and a white-bodied person might get 8 absences when the policy is 5, and you're really going to hold to that policy when it's a person of color. It might lead to participant retention issues. So when the person that's in your group does not feel like they're actually getting what they need out of it, or they feel like you're not invested in them, they're not going to stick around. It also can make it difficult for facilitators to stick around because they feel ineffective or they feel a lack of safety in the work because they continue to struggle with the dynamics that they're experiencing based off of their own personal experiences. Ultimately, that leads to program ineffectiveness. Folks aren't getting what they need from the program, and it leads to a lack of safety for survivors. The other thing I put in here is over alignment, and I'll also say fragility. This is something, it's borrowed wisdom from a new leader here, which was lovely because she came in and was able to see things that we were struggling to see. And with fragility, it's also that you feel like, oh, this person comes from this oppressed community, and therefore they don't have all of these skills or the capacity to engage in a specific way. And so I'm going to assume that they can't. And by doing that, I might go to an extreme in the way that I either allow for stuff to happen or not actually, like, what the things that I might do for them instead of actually encouraging them to build that muscle for themselves and recognize that they have the capacity within themselves. I think these are all program impacts that we get to see, right? We see what happens in our programs. We see people come and go. We are aware of these things. The participant impact, I think, is difficult because we might know something happened, but we don't have to see the actual impact of that often. So if we kick somebody out of programming, it might mean incarceration or prolonged probation. It might lead to technical violations. It might lead to a distrust of intervention programs where they feel like they're just not going to actually get served. It could lead to internalized depression and just reinforcing experiences and perceptions that our clients might have about themselves. and that are things that we're really trying to actively work against through the intervention program. Eventually, it might lead to a lack of access to domestic violence programs. Let's say that this person has already blown through 3 and you're the last place that they can go in your city or your state. And if they don't make it here, then it goes to something that's more severe. It keeps them out of community. It could result in the loss of access to their children and ultimately recidivism and a lack of safety for survivors. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to have reflection questions. I'm going to encourage folks to use these as tools that you can go back to continue to build your own insight. But things to think about is, what are some ways that you hold power as a facilitator or provider working with folks that use violence? What are some examples of ways that your power has negatively impacted participants? And what are some ways that your power has positively impacted participants? And really thinking about, do you have patterns around that? What was going on for you, and what were some of the underlying beliefs that you had when you were engaging in one of these specific ways? The second tactic is recognizing your capacity for change. So as providers that are working with folks that use violence, most often we're doing this work because we absolutely believe that folks that have used violence can become nonviolent. And that by providing specific teachings or services, that their life can be improved and that they don't have to return to systems of punishment. If we can think that for our participants, then it's also important for us to know that for ourselves. When we think about change, we also think about the malleability of our brains, right? We know that we can learn new things even if we've had a really strong experience of doing it one way in the past. And part of the way we do that is by repetition. And in the same way that someone who's an alcoholic can relapse, someone who uses violence can relapse, the ways that we engage in harm when it comes specifically to racial bias, we also can relapse, right? We can make mistakes and have to relearn and continue to practice a different way of being. Another question is, what is one place that could be an opportunity for growth or change in regards to biases that you might hold? And what are ways that you can, or what are strengths that you might have within yourself that you can use to leverage this type of change? Tactic 3 is breaking stereotypes. So stereotypes are really powerful and they can empower or disempower an entire group of people. They're also rooted in various forms of harm. If it's stereotypes about gender, masculinity, the use of violence, or race, we really understand that our identity and that of other people is really based off of the things that we think that are norms and expectations about ourselves, about our environment, about other people. And breaking down stereotypes and looking for discrepancies in what we think we know can support those shifts in our bias. When it comes to programming for folks that use violence, we do this by modeling healthy relationships between facilitators, having healthy and positive male and female facilitators, be able to model healthy communication, partnership, problem solving, holding different perspectives and still moving forward, and really modeling what could be possible in the relationships that our participants have in their personal lives. We break down stereotypes about what we expect from folks who have the capacity to harm by humanizing folks that use violence and recognizing their strengths, their talents, their history, their interests, their resilience, their value, in order to offset the idea that once you have harmed, you no longer have or are worthy of receiving care, forgiveness, or health. And I think in relation to our work on racial bias, I think we do this to ourselves. If we make a mistake, then we can get really lost in all the negativity around it and feeling shame and guilt, or feeling isolation and judgment, instead of really thinking through all these other aspects of who we are and the person that might be calling us in, to stay in this mindset of reflection and curiosity. But all of these things really inform our movement towards punishment or rehabilitation, or with folks that are using violence, whether we're keeping them in community or if we're reenacting something that is a byproduct of domestic violence, which is isolation, that we know a lot of victims experience. So the next reflection question is, what stereotypes might you be holding or have been taught to you that could impact your work with folks that use violence? that do not match your identity. And then think through stereotypes and write down experiences, observations, or teachings that you've been exposed to that might really counteract that stereotype. So, what are things that you have seen in community? What are things that you know about people that you've worked with? What are things that you know about yourself and your ability to actually move forward in a different kind of way? And how can you hang on to that when you're having your next experience of meeting somebody new who's going to challenge that core belief? Seeking out new learning and fostering empathy. This again is something that we really encourage in intervention and prevention programming. There is a comedian and a writer. His name is Baratunde Thurston. He has a really good TED Talk, and I will put some of these resources, I'll share them with Brittany so that they can be attached to the platform. But he has a really excellent TED Talk that talks about this method of deconstructing racism, utilizing headlines in newspaper articles. And so when we see articles about, for example, if we were to take that article that said that the police officer feared for his life because somebody had the audacity to smoke marijuana in front of their children, how might we flip that headline so that we're really calling out what the bias is, right? And naming what the bias is so that we can have this reframe and this alternative perspective. In order to seek out new learning and foster empathy, challenging our preconceived and really deeply entrenched notions about who people are and what they're capable of is really a vital part of being able to engage in that type of not just thinking and shifts in thinking, but also the way that we then act out and respond to the things that we're noticing in our community. When I talked about working with the homeless youth community and doing street outreach, part of the reason that that was such a powerful experience for me is as a South Asian person and someone who has a lot of melanin and has a darker complexion, a lot of my learning was around coming from a community where colorism is very present. So the darker you are, the less value you have. The less value you have, the harder it is to get married. There's a judgment about what's beautiful. And so there's less beauty in that person, but it's also associated with more devious behavior. I would say, as a South Asian person, anti-Blackness is also something that is really ingrained. And part of that is because of colonial teachings and coming here and integrating into a community where you're seeking acceptance. And you know that here is a community that does not get accepted by the people that hold power and have the capacity to really impact what your future looks like. And so anti-Blackness is absolutely like deeply rooted in South Asian culture. And so as a street outreach worker, my job was to walk towards men of color specifically and folks of color in neighborhoods that were predominantly people of color, and walk up to folks that seemed like they were loitering, right? Things that we might think about stereotypes where you would not want to actually engage with that person. And my job was to walk up to them, to build a connection, to find out more about who they were, and eventually become part of the landscape of that community so that I became someone that people could recognize as approachable and safe. With the ultimate goal of being able to connect folks to resources so that they could move forward in their life and have access to different things that they might need to gain stability and safety for themselves. When I was going through that experience, it was really scary and extremely uncomfortable until it wasn't anymore. And part of that was continuing to engage in that type of work and challenge myself every day, and surround myself with people that were willing to call me in. So this is a quick tool, easy tool that I like. There was no reference to it, but there is a packet that asks you some reflective questions that I'll also put onto my presentation site. But this is an easy way for you to think through how to actually slow down when you're experiencing something and be curious about it. So the acronym is PAUSE. Pay attention to what's actually happening between the judgments or beneath the judgments and assessments. So paying attention to what maybe was your initial reaction. Acknowledge your own reactions, interpretations, and judgments. Noticing what's going on in your body. I will tell you that our bodies often are the first thing to react. And so if we start to develop that awareness, then when we notice something doesn't feel right, it can help trigger our cognitive thinking around what does this mean and what's coming up for me. Understand that other reactions, interpretations, and judgments that understand what other reactions, interpretations, and judgments may also be possible. Search for the most empowering, productive way to deal with the situation and execute your action plan. And I love this quote: freedom lies in our ability to pause between stimulus and response. And again, I want to keep pointing out all of these ways that this really mimics the work that we do with folks that use violence in their relationships. So, other questions to reflect on. Think about a time where you made an assumption about someone's identity specifically due to race. What did you think about them and why? What might have helped you see that person differently or navigate through that moment differently with the hindsight that you have now? And is there anyone that you're working with that comes to mind that you can recognize in your previous reflections where you want to move forward differently? And I will say these are all great questions to ask when you're really struggling with someone, so that you can really break down what's going on with that case, what's coming up for you, and see if there's something new that you become aware of that can help how you move forward. The fifth tactic is engage in your own identity development. And I think this is one of the most important and also, I don't want to say underutilized, but it's something that many people do not do and they're not aware of. But each of us has our own racial identity. And it's important for us to know how we move through our own development, the different milestones around developing our own racial identity, so that we can have a better understanding of who we are, where we come from, and how that impacts the way that we navigate the world. A lot of white bodied folks don't feel like they have culture or feel like they have this racial identity that they can connect with. But the reality is that everyone does. So there's a woman named Janet Helms who created a process, like a framework for moving through stages of racial identity development work. And she created a model specifically for white bodied folks. And from her work, other practitioners created multiple models for folks of color. Um, when you are doing this work, it's really important to remember that it can be dynamic in that you can move to stage 3 and then bounce back to stage 1. And we actually saw this, I will say, collectively around the time of George Floyd's murder. So as a community, folks were really going through this racial reckoning and thinking through what groups they were a part of, what was their thinking before, what kind of change do we want to make? And we saw two different things happen. One was that different communities went back to their own community and did not want to engage with anyone that was different than them. And others really tried to bridge the gap and start to reach out to folks that they'd never had a connection with. And both of those things are different stages in racial identity. Eventually, the goal is that you get to a place where you have both. You have a strong connection to your own community that you associate with, and you have connections to a variety of other folks that are different races, gender, sexuality, religion, culture, that really creates this beautiful, diverse experience that you get to have. And I would really recommend that folks look through this. This is also something that will be on that site, is some of these different frameworks, both for folks of color and for white-bodied folks. So what is your connection to your own racial and ethnic community right now? What comes up for you when you think about race or anticipate talking about it? And how are you feeling now as compared to when you started the webinar? And I would ask folks to really think through, notice what's going on in your body. Again, top to bottom. Is there tightness? Is there more space? Are you not feeling the bottom half of yourself? It's important to recognize what's there and also what's missing when you're trying to pay attention to what's happening physiologically and what that can help you build insight around in regards to your reaction, your bias, and the way that you move through your work with folks that use violence. I'll also say that when we think about what comes up for us when we're having these conversations, I will say when I'm thinking about my organization, we just had a meeting last week where we do reflective practice around race. And many of the folks of color in that room went through, and their reflection was that it was really hard to do the reading and it's really hard to be in the space with folks of all different races because of their anxiety and concern about what a peer might say. That's really rooted in their implicit bias and their racial bias. And when it got to me, I was like, yeah, I hate this meeting, even though I'm the person that requires it and asks all of my team members to engage in it. And that led to conversations around how uncomfortable it was for white bodied folks to sit in a room and listen to folks of color actually voice the things that they're concerned about and what they could do to minimize that discomfort. And where the conversation went is that the discomfort was more about the white bodied person and their ability to sit in that discomfort and hear what their team members of color were saying than it was really about team members of color not being comfortable, because this was the one space where they actually got to safely voice an experience that they have all the time. And so when you find that you are feeling uncomfortable in a conversation about race, you find that it's anxiety provoking, you feel like it's threatening, be curious about why that's coming up for you and about whether your response is about yourself truly or if it's about the people that are around you that you're trying to serve, that you're working with. So the next tactic is commitment to change as a program. And this is really important because we can do this work individually, but we absolutely have an impact as organization, as a system. And this commitment to change is one of the very first steps that we can take in engaging in anti-racism and really questioning and challenging our racial bias. What this means is it creates an opportunity for community within your organization where, again, you can have that mutual aid. Folks can provide feedback and learn how to receive it in a way that's constructive. It's really important to remember that we are one piece of a puzzle, and our participants, after they're done with their work with us, have to go back into these different systems and communities. And if they continue to experience oppression, stressors, it all is just barriers that can lead to a return to use of violence. So questions to ask: what is one way that you could attend and integrate reflection around your racial identity development and racial socialization around racial bias within your work? What we do as an organization, lots of things. So we have required reading. One book that we're reading is My Grandmother's Hands by Reza Manikim. There is a reflective journal that we have all of our team members complete every month. Our board also engages in this. Our finance director, everyone at the organization, top to bottom, is required to read the book and engage in the journal reflections. Once a month, we do a reflective practice group that really follows a reflective practice model where we ask a question and everyone goes around and says what comes up for them in order to minimize people giving each other feedback and not actually talking about themselves and being accountable to their own change. We provide time and space for our team members to go to trainings and to engage in some of these tactics. So breaking stereotypes is a good one. When it is, like, as an example, African American History Month or Black History Month, we give our team members paid time to go to a museum or to go somewhere and do something that is going to counteract stereotypes that they might have. Learn something new about the cultures of the people that they're working with so that they're bringing in that knowledge and that understanding along with everything else. So thinking about ways that you could institutionalize the opportunity for this kind of change and recognizing, valuing, honoring the fact that it is absolutely professionally and ethically important when it comes to doing work with this population. And then the last is track your progress and measure for change. I will say a really good example of a dumpster fire was our attempt to make our policies more equitable that looked like having a more flexible attendance policy for our group for folks that use violence. And what we ended up finding, because we were tracking people's absences, is that we ended up providing way more absences than we should have for participants that were coming through a group. And we talk about our structure as a steel box with velvet lining, and both are really important in order to provide and engage in accountability work. And what we ended up creating was a ton of velvet lining with no steel box. So by looking at our attendance and our completion data, we were able to see, well, we tried to create this policy and it had the opposite effect than what we wanted. It resulted in folks staying in systems longer and not completing programming, which was the opposite of what we were trying to do. If we weren't willing to look at that and measure it and go back and be like, hey, we made a mistake, we have to change this, then we might continue to do that in a way that's actually causing harm to the people that we're trying to serve. So thinking through, what are some ways that you could integrate this reflection into your own practice as a facilitator, and what are some things that could be a part of your organization's values that could help you navigate racial bias and really help you focus on different areas that you can lean into and challenge yourself when it comes to the way that you work with folks that use violence. So going back to these guiding principles, I think this is one of my favorite tools to use as a facilitator and as a leader when I think about what is required to do good work with folks that are using violence to ensure that the outcome is change and safety for both my participant and their survivor. It's really to make sure that all of our decisions are rooted in these grounding principles. So we have this printed, laminated, it's up on my wall. Our team members have this resource. And when we are consulting about cases that are particularly difficult for us or challenging, when we are looking at policy changes, when we're looking at changing our curriculum, these are all principles that we go back to and use as a tool to really hold ourselves accountable and check to see whether what we're doing is really living and breathing into these principles, rooted in these principles, to ensure that our work is anti-oppressive, anti-racist, and really centered around values that can lead to positive, healthy change for the folks that we work with. So as you're looking at those principles, I think I would encourage looking at which ones feel really easy for you to lean into, and which of them feel like a challenge for you independently and for the team, group, organization that you work for. And what is one tactic that you could use to combat the challenges that you've identified, allowing you to lean into those guidelines and values as a facilitator. So action plan. And folks have a hard time doing this because it's actual accountability, but I'm going to encourage everyone to do this. I would love for folks to think about who is somebody that could be a good accountability partner for you. Our intervention program has a culturally specific curriculum for folks in the military. And one of the things that we do is we have them identify a battle buddy in the group. And that person is the person that is really tasked with paying attention to their battle buddy, noticing when they're dismissive, when they're victim blaming, and is committed to making sure that they're watching out for that group member and calling them in when they're doing something that could cause harm. So think through, like, who might that person be for you in your environment, whether it's a family member, coworker. I want to encourage folks to look at your calendars and schedule a time with them to talk about this presentation, talk about the tactics that you heard about today, and think through one thing that you're going to do to challenge yourself to reflect around racial bias for you, for your team. And then 1 month from that date, reconnect and debrief about what you actually leveraged, what changed, what was difficult, and how you want to move forward. I hope everyone will do this. Okay, this slide, there's just a lots of different resources out there that I wanted to make folks aware of that can help with your own personal reflection. I mentioned a book by Resma Manikim. He has this free online course. It's 5 sessions. It's super short, actually, but very impactful that you could use. There's different models. Recovering from white conditioning and white supremacy is one that our team did for several years and really shows us how we're conditioned to engage in racism in lots of different ways that doesn't look like a person burning a cross with a white pointy hat. But when you follow the thread all the way down, it's absolutely rooted in some of the teachings from that time. And then different books that can either expand your understanding of experiences of African American folks, of Indigenous folks, of systems, and different ways that they can keep folks in the system instead of helping them get out, and different ways that you can expand your own understanding around the preconceived notions or teachings that you've been given around race. And then this is the last tool. And this is a quote that I love, and I sometimes have it as my Zoom picture so that when I'm worried about saying something in a meeting, I can turn my camera off and see that photo there as a reminder that this is what I want to do. So when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. So if we really think about what our ultimate goal is and who we're doing this work for and why it's important, it can give us so much strength because it's not about us. It's about the folks that we are serving. And so important for us to be able to show up in that kind of way. So that's what we have for today. I'm going to move over to questions. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. Okay, so one question. I've noticed many better intervention programs tend to ignore this in a group setting and move on to the next topic or question when participants try and share experiences. Facilitators' view is one size fits all. Conversations and trainings are deeply needed for something regarding this. Do you provide coaching group trainings? Yes. Okay, to address the first part, I do think that a lot of programs do move forward. And something that we talk about in our program is that when someone's bringing that up, we want to give them space to talk about it because it's part of their identity. It might be part of what has created that stressor that led to use of violence, right? And so if we're not creating space for it, then we're not addressing something that absolutely might be connected to the change that they need to engage in or that they want to engage in. When there are events that happen, like I mentioned, there's been lots of things happening in Minnesota. We intentionally bring it up in our group so that folks feel like they can talk about it. And we work with a majority of men of color. And it created a lot of really important space to talk about their experiences. I will say, like, one example that I wouldn't tell everyone to do, but I felt comfortable doing it because I knew the group really well, was around the time of George Floyd. We talked about what it was like for our participants, talked about what it was like for them when they saw police officers. And one gentleman in our group said that he could be riding in the back of a car as a passenger, and if a police car drove by, he would absolutely have this physiological response, and he could name lots of things that are part of your threat response. And so I asked them to play musical chairs. And what if it was that it was their victim sitting in the back of a car and it was them that drove by? Could they then relate to the threat response that a victim might feel? And they could go there because we talked first about their experience of oppression and then how they might be engaging in it with other people. So I absolutely would encourage that. I'll also say people don't talk about it because they're not comfortable. So practicing having those conversations as a team is going to help people bring it into their space as providers. And happy to talk more. My email address is on the slide deck if folks are interested in deeper work around this. There is little racial diversity in intervention programs here. Many educators feel like it's hard to address race if it's an all or mostly white group, and they worry about distracting from the focus of the class. Do you have recommendations for supporting these educators? Yes. I think that even though we might be in an all in a homogenous community, that doesn't mean that we're not getting indoctrinated or conditioned to think about things in a specific way. My parents grew up in Sri Lanka, little island across the globe, and they learned a lot around anti-Blackness that they brought with them here without having any connection to folks that identified as African American. And so I think those things can come into play when we're thinking about harm in general. If we can engage in racial violence, then it makes it easier for us to engage in other types of violence. And so I wouldn't bring up race issues in a group of white-bodied folks unless somebody brought it up or I felt like it was relevant to what we were talking about, because you also want to balance that out with preaching around anti-oppressive practice and thinking about who that's for, right? Always want to tie it back to what's happening with the client or what's happening in community. Are there assessments to or that you can recommend that would help address or discuss this in group? Yes, one of the links that I shared was a an implicit bias screening. It's free. I believe it's through Harvard, but you answer a series of questions and then it tells you where you are in your process. I think that is a really good assessment. There's also something called the IDI, the Intercultural Inventory. And what it does is it tells us like most people feel like they are further along than they are. And so when we answer questions, we answer it from an intellectual place versus our like lived and embodied response. And so I think from my perspective, the IDI does a really good job of helping us understand both where we want to be and where we are at a given time in our process around racial identity development and around how we show up in space, given all the different isms that we might engage in. That one you have to pay for, but it is a really great assessment. Some participants often parrot right-wing and racist sound bites, like those from Fox News. How do you recommend responding to things like that? It often just goes in circles. Yeah, I think thinking about the tools that we use to deconstruct core beliefs and really help our participants question their thinking around their perspective around victims or a specific situation is actually a great way to work through that. If somebody continues to bring up a soundbite, something that's racist, then thinking through, okay, what are the behaviors, actions, feelings? What is it that you're actually trying to communicate? And what is it that's coming across? I also love asking people to explain what they mean when they say things like that, because as you start to talk about it, it becomes really apparent that what you're saying is extremely racist and helps people check themselves because often they just get to say it without having to be accountable to their statements. And so finding ways to help them really break down their statements and think about where it's coming from. And I wouldn't have the goal be that you want to change their changes so they don't ever say something racist. I would have the goal be creating the opportunity for them to build insight, right? I think Chris Huffine said this, but borrowed wisdom from a facilitator that we can't make somebody walk through the door. We can only create the opportunity for them to have that epiphany and know that the door is there, right? Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the time today.